Thanks very much, Patrick, and thanks again for letting me to speak. So I think one thing we've taken from all the great presentations that we've seen today has been the need for us to share information better. And when I mean us in the telecom security area. And what I'm doing here in my presentation is what I hope to impart to you is one way we think, and we hope the industry will also support us in this way, a way that we could learn from IT security to improve telecom security by a better way of sharing. So when we talk about sharing, what are we exactly sharing? We're sharing information on threats. And I was trying to think of a way of visually explaining what a threat could be, and what are the difficulties when it comes to recognizing a threat and then sharing information about a threat. And if you go to the next slide, what I also found myself doing over the weekend was watching some of this TV show. Some of you might recognize this. It's called Squid Game. I thought this particular image was a good analogy, and I'll actually come back to this image later on, because I'm going to use this image as a way to answer those two questions. One is what exactly is a threat, whether you can actually recognize a threat when you actually see it, which is one part of threat intelligence sharing. And then the second part of it, which the area that we're talking about, is how do you share information on a threat? In this particular case, if you're paralyzed by terror, it's difficult to share information on a threat, but you also need to convey any information you have on a threat in a sort of a structured manner, which is going to make sense to people who receive it, and they're actually going to be able to act upon it. There's no point just saying there's a problem or there's something we need to be scared about, unless you actually give some information which can be used by others. So if you go to the next slide. So related to this, the telecom industry, I would propose, has been quite effective in sharing information on some threats. So I'll give you one specific example. Around 4 years ago in Germany, there was a number of news reports which came out explaining how the SS7, which is the 2G, 3G protocol, which is the control plane protocol used for control of mobile devices, had been exploited. And when the attackers had gotten access to this protocol, they were able to basically exploit and empty some German subscribers' bank accounts. How they actually did this was that they got access, and then they intercepted text messages which have been used for two-factor authentication. This is actually not that common, but it's actually not that common from the use of this protocol to do this. Normally, this protocol is used primarily more for surveillance and for state-level types of attacks. But if you do get access, this is one particular type of attack you could execute. The interesting thing from us on the sharing perspective, and if you go to the next slide, is that this information had been actually shared within the GSM Association prior to some of the news releases came out. And the thing from our perspective is that at the time of the alert, the information which has been shared, one of the parts of information was what's called a global title. This is actually the source information of where these attacks was originating from. And as part of our service, what we do for our customers is we'd identified this particular source, and we'd associate with other sources as well. So we'd actually associated this group, and we built up a map essentially of this group. And we could see that they were using sources from the UK, but also other countries like Turkmenistan and a bunch of other countries as well. And when we seen this information, we actually communicated, because we could see that some people were being affected. We communicated this to multiple European operators who actually weren't our customers, but we understood that this information would be useful for them to try to deal with these attacks which are ongoing. As well as this information was also shared with law enforcement. So this is actually the premise of our internal customer system, which we use to share information within our customers, which we call Sigil. Now that's all very well and good, and it does show the capability of sharing. But then you have a question, is what do you do for the larger types of attacks? What do we do for situations where you don't have all the information, and if you want to move beyond this specific type of threat? So go to the next slide. So in that particular case, we could share information because everybody understood that what we were sharing, the types of information was, there was really no context that was required interpretation. But that technical level of sharing, it's not always possible. And as the previous speaker mentioned, Michael, the telecom area, we do have restrictions in the amount of information we could share. A lot of stuff that we work with is really quite confidential. We can't go around sharing information who's been targeted generally. You can't sometimes share specific information where it comes from, because it's quite sensitive areas to talk about people's identities. And at the same time, attackers, I've mentioned before, they're not technology fixed. If we were to build up a system that just shares information on SS7 or 3G attacks, This is not going to work for 4G attacks, it's not going to work for SMS, it's not going to work for any type of combined type of attack. Attackers don't think about technology in that they're going to limit themselves to that. Attackers think about how they're going to do their attacks and if they're going to be successful or not. So what we really need is a language to express the activity of telecom attackers or threat actors. We need to be able to ways to share what they do and how they do it without necessarily focusing on the specifics of how they go about doing this. And to do this as well, this better sharing, it has a side effect that allows you a greater understanding of the threats and then to build in defenses against them. If you're able to speak and able to conceptualize something in your head, obviously then you're able to better understand it, you're able to see where you may be lacking, and then of course you're also able to communicate about it better as well. So if we go to the next slide. So sometimes coming back again to my Squid Game analogy, some people say, well, no, it's always better to give all the details. You need all the details to be able to say if a threat is good or bad or not. But I give one thought experiment here, that if I was to give you, the viewers of this, two different types of information. One on the left is a really precise piece of information. And then on the one on the right is a much, much more higher level type of information. So I'll give you 30 seconds or a minute to have a read of these two. But then the question comes down to is which type of information would you prefer? Would you actually prefer a whole dump of information of somebody's observation of what's actually happened? Or would you prefer an actual very, very high level, much, much shorter level of information, which is just basically tactics or techniques? Now, I should have actually said spoiler alert. Possibly I've spoiled it for some of you if you ever go watch this TV show. It's only the first episode, there's plenty other, but I would surmise that most people, or at least myself I know, would prefer the side on the right. They would prefer just to be given specifics as opposed to actually precise details, or at the very least given high level information on the side of the right doesn't necessarily mean you're not able to act on the threats which are present. So in this particular case, having all the details does not necessarily mean a better result for you, the defender, than actually having high level specifics. So the reason we cover this, if you just go to the next slide, is that this is what we want to do in the telecoms world. So like I mentioned before, is that we obviously us and other companies can share information internally. We've covered earlier, and David Rogers, the first speaker, spoke about how within the GSMA, the TTIS group is sharing information, mobile malware, piece of information, indicators of compromise, especially in the relevant flu bot. But we need to build up a bigger way of system, as sometimes we say, you know, we need a better way of doing this. And we know that these threat actors, they're not going to specifically stake on one particular method or a different method. They're going to do whatever they can do to get the information. So we need to think of a language and need to think of a method of how we could share details of these attackers while still respecting privacy. And at the same time, the more that we can, if we actually build up this system, the more that we can think that this idea of sharing is standard. At the moment, if something exists, then you must think about it. And if you think about it, you then begin to assume that it's always been present. So we want to get us more into a way of thinking that this is something sharing that we should do as opposed to nice to have. So as mentioned a few times, within the IT world, there is a common framework, which is called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And what this does describes the detailed approach an attacker uses in terms of tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques. So I won't go into details, but it's widely supported by many tools and it's used throughout the IT industry. And as well as that, also gives, from my perspective, a common framework as well. My understanding is that it gives a common framework for people to speak about what an attacker is doing, as opposed to really, and you can get into it, but as opposed to really jump into the details, allows also people to step back and think about this is what an attacker is doing, and this is how it's exhibiting its behavior. So you may well say, well, then this is obviously a thing we should be doing. We should just reuse this. But unfortunately, we have some issues when it comes to using this in our particular mobile network area. Let's go to the next slide. So there is on the right-hand side what's called a list of matrices. Unfortunately, there is a framework for mobile, but this is very, very much device-centric. It really has Android and iOS. So essentially, it doesn't really consider mobile operators. It does have a part of it called network-based effects, but if you look at it, those are really separate and standalone, and they don't take into account the large number of mobile network attack cases that we and mobile operators see in real life. As well as that, it also does consider 5G in any of these cases. And some people have addressed this and been aware of this, and there have been theoretical attempts in the past to create mobile network-based models. Now, these unfortunately have also got some issues because, as mentioned before, in our panel discussion, the more you move away from MITRE, the more difficult it is to stay compatible with it. And in those particular cases, one particular case, Beta, it was an excellent start, but it wasn't actually, some of its definitions weren't actually compatible with MITRE. And as well as that, more importantly, they haven't really had much in the way of take-up. There hasn't been much in the way of industry consensus. So what we've have at the moment is everybody agreeing, as you've heard in all these presentations, that there should be more information sharing, but there's really no easy way to do this or no appropriate way to do this when it comes to mobile network attacks, which is what a lot of us work in, especially when it comes to things like signaling, control-based signaling, or in the area of 5G. So what to do in a situation? So if we go to the next slide. What our objective then will be, and what it should be, we believe as industry, is to use this framework and basically come up with a new way, a model of doing this. So basically define a model for all the adversary tactics techniques that we see based on what we see in real life. So it has been discussed before. One of the possibly faults, but also one of the areas is that in the mobile network security world, a lot of information is shared, but a lot of it sometimes isn't shared public. And this is due to some well-known reasons. Some of it is sensitive, but also because it is a relatively closed community. And as a result of this, then some of this information isn't actually out there. Some of these real life attacks aren't actually out there, but we have it. Us in the industry, we have this knowledge. And if we build this system or we allow sharing information, then this is something that can be used by SIEM systems, can be sea-level summaries and so on. But any attacks, any descriptions that we build has to take into account what do operators deal with today. So it's got to take into account all the signaling protocols I talked about, telecommunication protocols. There has already been a huge amount of work in the past, obviously on IT type protocols, but for us, what we're talking about, the attacks that we see, is really this vast ocean of telecom protocols, which we need to consider. Especially, we also need to consider that any system we come up with is future-proof. We've talked about how previous speakers that 5G is going to eat the world. Well, if 5G is going to eat the world, we need to make sure that we have systems to share information on the threats that will eat that world. And the 5G is not exactly a straightforward it's not a straightforward replacement of 3G, 4G. It has concepts like slicing. It reuses a whole different bunch of other protocols, but it's also built on top of 2G and 3G and 4G. So it's a really, really complex type system. And then most importantly, it's got to be compatible with the attack ecosystem and supported by the industry. There's no point of us coming up with any system which is just like a theoretical exercise. Previous speaker, Michael, talked about, coming up with methods which then aren't actually used, which don't have, the four techniques, trust, money, time, and attention. So those really all add up to, it needs to be supported by industry and kept up to date. So if we go to the next slide. So what we're proposing, as you probably see where we're going with this, is a method of extending the MITRE attack for mobile network operators. There is, I said already, a series of matrices. Mobile matrix, as I mentioned, is very device, handset, phone centric, but it does have some good areas in what's called the network effects tactics. Looking at some of the other matrices, other parts we can take from those. I mean, the enterprise matrix, it has many different types of telecom attacks, but it's missing protocols. And the attacker behaviors we need to consider the attackers is different in telecom networks and enterprises. Telecom networks, the attackers are actually within the networks, unlike possibly enterprises where they're coming from outside. In many cases, like for example, in surveillance networks, we can see that they've got access via telecom networks. So it's not you cannot deal with every situation, every problem is saying they're authenticated or not, is that these attackers are actually within the networks. And then, as mentioned, there was other previous attempts, one called Bedra. This is, again, an excellent start, but it is quite high level, and some of the attacks are different than what's described. And then finally, there is, of course, another matrix as well in matrix attack called ICS, but this is also something to look at, but it's not really suitable for telecom protocols and 5G. So what we would propose to do is essentially to extend the attack mobile matrix by adding in a third matrix, as well as iOS and Android. And then we would take parts from the existing matrix which is in there and then use different types of subtypes which we can see around the place in the different matrices. And the whole purpose of this then is that any system that we come up with then is compatible with what's out there, or at least the concepts and ideas behind it are compatible to what's present. So we're able to reuse it. And so that other people from outside our telecom security industry, they can basically look at this and say, okay, this kind of makes sense. This is something we could use. So if we go to the next slide. So the details of how this could work is we could have a new matrix, like I said, under mobile. This will be based on realistic attacks and adversary behaviors, which we and other in the industry and mobile operators have seen in real life. We can use tactics from mobile. We reuse them in really the following order. First, you take what's best from the mobile matrix. Then you take ones from maybe from the enterprise for IT and 5G, especially some of the techniques in the enterprise are really applicable for some of the specific attacks we could see in 5G. And then we could take another ideas and measures that we could take from what's called the beta framework. But there will be a lot of new sub-techniques we'll have to add, and these will all be based on real attacks. So as part of that, we've actually studied many of these attacks and mapped them out. But I'll say to you, the industry and for you, the target audience for this is that we will need more operator industry input on different types of attacks, because there's little point for us to come up with a standard for AdaptiveMobile or for anybody else to come up with a standard for themselves. This is something, a standard that we need for all of us to share this type of information, because unless we do that, there's going to be a situation like we have before where we're constantly talking about different types of attacks, but we don't have a common language in which to share them. So go to the next slide. So this is what we've done. I'll talk about our contributions and how others can get involved in a moment, but so far I must warn you as well, this is a complicated piece of work, and it's not made easier by the fact is that the knowledge of attacks, which is what the core driver of building these techniques, is in a much smaller group of people than the equivalent types of attacks in the IT world is. So this is something which we've been working on. It looks somewhat like a periodic table, but this is basically what's called the matrix, or this is how the viewpoint of it, and we'd all have all the different techniques on top, and then you'd have different types of ways, which are the bottom, the columns going downwards, all the different types of techniques within this. So the top line, apologies, will actually be the tactics, and then the lines going downwards be the techniques. And so by capturing all of these, then attackers would be able to classify and categorize as part of what they're actually doing from a telecom perspective, and actually then when people analyze this information, they could use this information then to build up ways to actually stop any types of attacks and block them. So if you go to the next slide. So I just want to let everybody know where we are with this framework. We have done within Adaptive, especially my colleague, Dr. Silke Holtman, done a huge amount of research in this to come up with these initial frameworks, tactics, and techniques. And we have some, including some people on this conversation, we have some operator support as well, and other stakeholders as well, support for the need for the system. So we have discussed this as well. I'm sure some of the MITRE people on the line might be aware of this, that, you know, the proposed framework in progress. And the output of that is that because where MITRE work from is that they really work from information of these attacks being made public. One massive sticking point is for them working on it is that they don't really have this information. The best people who have these information attacks are those of us in the actual mobile industry ourselves. So those of us both in the mobile security vendor community and also the mobile operators itself. So probably the best way to continue this for now is outside of MITRE and to come up with a framework in the industry. So where to do that? So we've already discussed this within the GSM Association. And now is that, as Dave Rogers mentioned, the plan is also that we will be presenting this in 2 weeks with our colleagues within the GSMA, and that we will be proposing that we take this forward within the GSM Association. Because within that group, within the fraud and security group specifically, there is the best combination and concentration of knowledge when it comes to mobile attacks and what we've seen in real life. And I can't stress how important this is. Not only have we talked about in this whole so much about the different types of the need for information sharing, it's only going to be more important. For example, in March earlier on this year, the ENISA group within the EU founded a threat intelligence working group, and it's envisioned that a large part of that sharing within that group is also going to be using MITRE. And the EU have also recognized as well that telecoms, as they clearly are, a part of critical piece of national infrastructure. So we need to be able to communicate the threats that occur within our industry, in all parts of our industry. So I would say to you who are maybe interested in getting involved, if you want to support this initiative, join us in the GSMA. Like I said earlier, we're not doing this because this is necessarily going to benefit AdaptiveMobile. Specifically, we're doing this because we need this form of information sharing in our group, because it's very difficult for threats and different types of attacks to be communicated intelligently throughout an organization without assuming that they know everything. We need a language to be able to support this. We need a language to be able to underframe these types of attacks and actually understand what's going on. So I'm not sure how I'm doing time, so I'll basically finish up. Like I said, if you're willing, if you want to support this, please, if you're members of the GSM Association, we will speak to you in the next fraud and security group. And yeah, final reference to Squid Game. It's a green light, so now you can unfreeze and ask questions. And that is it, Patrick.
Fantastic, Cathal. Thanks so much. Well, you won't have been aware because you've been focusing on your talk. I won't use the word lit up because it would be a bit grandiose. However, we have had a great deal of activity on the Q&A function and on the chat function, with a lot of people expressing a lot of enthusiasm for this, asking can they get copies of the slides, can you come forward. I think there's somebody from MITRE saying that they want to talk to you. So we've had a really tremendous response to your talk there, which is obviously terrific. Yeah. I suppose just to put a couple of questions to you, it seems to me that potentially the fundamental issue in terms of the relative slowness with which this has been developing over the last couple of years is that, you know, the biggest attacks, the most painful cyber attacks have been on office IT. So that's where all the money's going. That's where organizations want the spending to go. And therefore, so long as, you know, attacks that arise from via the telecom network, so long as they are somewhat secondary in the mind share of business organizations and their CISO teams, this is going to be a bit of an uphill struggle. Is the logic there right, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'll take it 2 points. In the IT world, I won't say they're standing on the shoulders of giants, but there's been so much work and there's been so much research that's been done over time. It's a very well understood area. It's like its whole huge amount of work which has been done over the last 20 years in the whole IT security area. And when it comes to telecom security, you can see it's not something which is normally considered by people. It's something which is sort of, by people, I mean people who don't work directly in that area. And it's always something seen as somewhat exotic and esoteric and it's over the side. But when you consider it, more people use the mobile network than use the internet. You know, it's like this huge, consider this huge iceberg of potential threats, which most people wouldn't be aware from the surface. So, and also, I think we need a language like this because, not least for those of us working in telecom security, we need to show to others within the cybersecurity industry that we exist, to be perfectly honest.
Right.
And how people work in the cybersecurity industry, they have their own framework, they work with MITRE, they know things. If we can't even express the threats that we see in a language that they are aware of, how are they meant to consider and pay money for security solutions?
Certainly.
So we need to show that.
Last question I'm going to put to you. I mean, you've had a lot of positive reaction, and there's an audience here that hasn't expressed anything in particular, but has heard your message. Is this the first time you have socialized this with a large industry group?
This is the first time we've talked about it publicly. We have obviously discussed it within the
GSMA, yeah.
But as a sort of an information that this has been worked. Obviously, we spoke with MITRE in the past, but very keen to talk to other people MITRE. So this is the first time we've spoken publicly, but I would emphasize this is not an AdaptiveMobile initiative. This is something we want the industry to take forward. So this is something we'll socialize again in the next FA Fraud and Security Group, and I hope in that meeting it will become a GSMA initiative, to be honest.
Fantastic. Well, anyone who's attending, listening now, or listening to the recording, very welcome to get in touch with Cathal at AdaptiveMobile about that. Cathal, thanks for a sensational presentation. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.